Musashi's also, the lore is that he's undefeated, but like I said, there's a couple of people who are supposedly, but as far as like how the swordsmen who became Zen writers or Zen philosophers, well, I guess technically a lot of them were Zen philosophers anyway, but the ones who wrote and recorded their philosophies established these things that go so far beyond sword fighting that it's where it's like you can apply it to anything.
Well, I think there's a really important historical context, is that at the end of the Tokugawa period, the end of the Edo period, it was the end of the Meiji, or the Meiji Restoration. And so there was this really significant push to incorporate Western cultural aspects and technology, and Japan was sending, students, essentially ambassadors, to study the West and bring back as much as they could so that they could integrate themselves into a larger economy, because they saw what was going on in China, and they didn't want to deal with an embargo on their own shipping lanes, and so they kind of were smart. They acquiesced to the British, and then of course the offer that the Americans made. And post-Civil War, they gave them guns, and that was the Great Leveler. And then, of course, taking away the swords and saying, you can't even have a top knot. Got to start dressing differently.
Oh yeah.
There was a huge cultural shift in Japan, and so a lot of the samurai, a lot of them, they went on to become great philosophers, but a significant portion of them became the poets and established what we consider to be like, classical Japanese poetry at this point. And a lot of traditional Japanese music arose from that too. Japan's got a really fascinating culture. I mean, the entire written system, I believe, is the result of efforts made by women.
I wouldn't be surprised.
And so they had like this really complex record keeping system. It goes back a long time. Yeah. It's a really complex period of time.
Well, yeah, there's also this complexity of like misogyny that comes from the West that doesn't exist in these other contexts in the same way, and even in the example of Wing Chun as like an older martial art that was created by and for women specifically, that has not only practical applications but absolute respect among martial artists. So it's kind of like, if anything, it's crazy how much martial arts have been an equalizing force for the sexes for a long time, even down to now, where the UFC has, not just the UFC, but mixed martial arts has women and men competing on the same cards in the same league, even though they're not competing against each other. There's no women's UFC, like in the same way there's the WNBA and the WLPGA, or the LPGA rather, and women's football.
Exceptional Radio. Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Wow, that was random. Exceptional Radio.
I saw this fight promotion for UFC, actually, now that you mention it, and it had I think it was like a middleweight card or a welterweight card, anyways, there's a man to the left and a female fighter to the right, and at a quick glance, I thought, like, holy crap, is it going to be like a dual gender fight? I was really confused for a brief second, and then I click on the link, and then it expands the image, and then they show that there are 4 fighters, 2 men on the left and 2 men on the right, and they're both facing to the center of the image. And so it was kind of a deceptive image, because the thumbnail just clipped just enough so that I only saw the centered fighters, and then the names kind of made sense because I don't know who any of these fighters are.
Yeah.
And so it was actually kind of amusing.
What's happening? Well, that's how fake news gets, quote unquote, fake news gets spread.
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious that shit like that happens, and then you check yourself before being like, oh, they're having a mixed gender fight, and start spreading it, whereas some people would have seen that and spread it. And that's kind of where there's this element of internet culture. I think we've hit this weird point of people don't think about how they react to things in a way that it's like, okay, if we think of information as a virus, good or bad, bad viruses get spread a lot quicker than good viruses get spread. And the propensity is because people want to be the first to spread sexy information. So, like, if you had found proof that there was a mixed gender fight happening and nobody knew about it, internet culture
Holy crap, I would be like the man for that brief moment.
Right, yeah.
I would have been like
internet
the
culture,
beacon of information.
Thousands of retweets. And
oh, yeah.
People hearting your posts and your shit. Like, you're the fucking man for equality, and people are like shouting you out because you're supporting powerful women. And
I just want to be really clear. I might get like 2 or 3 shares of any post that I ever put on the internet at any point in my life. And usually it's the same 2 or 3 people that share my content. So big shout out to all y'all. I love you. Keep up the good work, because I know y'all get more likes on that stuff than I do. I'm not bitter. I'm really not. I actually love it that something that I share makes it to a broad audience somehow.
Well, that's funny. Well, what you're talking about is the way the algorithms work to make people feel small in a way that if you're an individual person, so the idea of a social influencer is a fucking paradox in that everyone's a social influencer. It's just a different scale. So the notion that there's these specific individuals like Paris Hilton and Ashton Kutcher and whoever the social influencer of the quote unquote of the day is, that these people are somehow more influential than the people on the ground, is a lie that's meant to keep people giving their influence to these people.
I think that there is a misconception about what influencers are, because I think people see somebody like Tosh.0 or whatever, that guy's show, and they confuse him with an influencer. But he's a content creator. He's a content aggregator. In a lot of ways, he's a journalist. And it's really surreal because he kind of emerges from that whole Hollywood instantaneous culture, but he's doing really complex.
I wouldn't call him a
commentary.
content creator. I'll call him a meta content creator because, he does stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
So stand-up comedy compared to what he does on Tosh.0, Tosh.0 is meta content in that
it's a commentary.
he's taking exactly. So this is where meta commentary or meta
content creation
content has always existed, but we haven't really had a way to describe it as being sort of relational in that journalism is technically meta content creation in most cases, unless it's like a complete expose, and even then an expose is sort of derivative of the subject about which is being covered, so that's still almost meta content creation. So that's kind of where, now that we are in a more meta society that's aware and can discuss things around the subject or object, I think now we have the capacity to say, like...
Well, I think we've reached critical mass in terms of information access, distribution, availability. And that's not to say that the future is finally evenly distributed or equally distributed. It's definitely not. But that's to say that there are enough people who have access to information on a fairly regular level, and of speed. You can get information up to the minute. And I'm not saying that we want like we don't want the first. We want accurate.
No.
But it's still possible now to become informed at a very high rate. And I think that's the key to being aware of meta content and meta creativity in that sense, because we never would have been able to see that the entire world was creating drum and bass at the same time without the internet.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have. We didn't know that disco was happening all over the world, and until the records were released. But now we know that somebody's making some brand new track in the middle of Indonesia, and they've got this fly tour in Vietnam next month that nobody in the United States has heard about, but they're like, selling out.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is.
Well, the issue is, do we actually know? The information is there, but because there's such a sea of it,
and there's no curation.
Right, and this gets back to Marshall McLuhan's notion of the global village hitting this critical mass point of where we're describing now, in that the capacity for individuals like ourselves to produce content that is qualitatively not much different than, or in some cases better, or in some aspects better than what's being produced in, say, a large studio. So, for example, the audio that you put out is, I can say, qualitatively and quantitatively better than what Kevin Smith's audio ever puts out because of certain factors. That's not even about like, oh, you're better. These are things that are measurable, but the issue is that you're working with 1/1000th of the budget that he's working with, but because of the democratization of technology via the intersection of how knowledge can be applied to technology to overcome capital restrictions or hurdles to get to the level where certain things can become equal, now you're able to put out audio that's better than Kevin Smith is putting out, but it's because you know what you're doing, and his audio guy doesn't know what they're doing. I don't know who the audio guy is, but he does not either have a spine enough to tell Kevin Smith to get different type of microphones and get them in fixed positions or whatever. I don't know what it is, but their podcast cannot put out good audio. And I have no problem saying that, because anybody can just go check. If you want to go check me on this and be like, oh no, Chris is bitter because they don't have as big an audience. No, just go fucking go listen to it.
Yeah.
Go listen to it and give them counts, because I'm not bitter about it. I'm saying this was predicted by McLuhan, because we're at a point where producers in Sunroom Studios can produce content that has the same audio quality as this fucking Smod Castle, which is a multi-million-dollar studio, but because they don't know what the fuck they're doing, your audio quality is better.
I think it's also a reflection of me being a little bit neurotic about how I want it to sound and putting a lot of effort into making it sound good.
That's
right.
That's part of it, but this is a time period that your neuroticism can only meet that quality because the technology is accessible. So if your computer, 30 years ago, this setup would have been so prohibitively expensive.
Oh, yeah.
That you wouldn't have been able to do it anywhere close. So even if you would have had the know-how in this room, you wouldn't have been able to set this up.
No, not
because it would have just been so prohibitively expensive. Now we're at a point where people are walking around with fucking cell phones
that are basically like supercomputers in 1980s terms.
Exactly. Not only would we have not had the capacity to buy computers this powerful, they would have been so expensive, and there wouldn't have been anything to do with them because the internet wasn't at the stage. It wasn't ready. There wasn't any Flash, any fucking HTML5, fucking Python that was ready to deploy what's happening now. All of these things had to happen to get to a point.
Make internet now.
Right, yeah. So there's all these things about the way that technology unfolded to get us to the point we're at now that McLuhan predicted, that we also take for granted, that also make it why we don't know about that DJ in Indonesia doing that random mix, because we all take this information for granted in such a way where we're like, we just consume it for the sake of existence and don't actually value it for its contribution to humanity, because there's such an ocean of it that we're now numb to it. And this is like, there's all these byproducts that were predicted as well.
You know, I remember for a long time reading arguments at forums about the differences in quality between vinyl and CD, and then Super Audio CD happened, and then the arguments kept going, and then digital has completely surpassed vinyl in terms of signal to noise ratio, and dynamic range potential, and you know, all sorts of things. But then it still doesn't matter, because there's some ephemeral quality to the vinyl that, for whatever, even when it's replicated digitally, it still isn't the same.
And it's in people's heads.
And
that's the crazy part about it.
It's really weird. We've got a bunch of really strange standards. I think the reason MP3s are acceptable is because they're actually still better than vinyl in a lot of ways. They'll and you can transfer them easily. You can transport an entire music library, you know, in a device the size of, you know, a stack of pennies, and it'll be accessible on almost any computer. Or you can just go to YouTube if you have active internet connections, and your entire, you know, the entire repository collection of all of humanity's music is there. And if it's not there, then there's probably a reason it's not on YouTube, because all the good stuff ends up on YouTube. But that's the thing, is that we get to this point where we've got all these options, and really it was good enough 70 years ago. It hasn't really needed to get better than that. It just needs to become more portable. And when people really, I mean, we've talked about the concept of the audiophile, the person who's so into their stereo that they're listening to the different noise qualities of the cables that go between the power amplifier and the speaker.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, is there's like, you know, we got really strange spectrum of expectations and standards, and it's where those things meet that we have, you know, people that just don't care. I think we've reached this level of apathy as a result of so many options and so many choices, that even like the low tier, like the not quite the bottom shelf, but like the first shelf from the bottom, that one, even those options are actually good enough for most people. But it's weird, because I feel like that's the opposite of the way it should be. We're in a place technologically and where we have access to information, where we can have all of these things. It's bottom line mentality, I think, is what it's done.
We also have, the bottom line mentality is something we can talk about, but when you translate that into the bell curve, think about what that actually means when you translate that to the bell curve. That means if you have 325 million people, roughly 61 million-ish people are functionally, failures in every sense of how things operate. And that's like the nicest way of saying it, in that this is why we're meant to be helping others in society in a way that everyone is in any sort of distribution of, whether it's talents, skills,
quality of network,
quality of whatever. There's only going to be a very small number of people who are going to have access to the best quality, and everybody else is going to have less quality. Don't have to even call it bad. There's just levels of quality, and once you get past 70%, 70% and down is not good. It's not the best quality that everyone has access to.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like we have an onus, and whatever it is, to help that 70% understand why they should get to the other 30%. So that's why if there's people listening to shitty headphones that are like the fucking earbuds that came on a plane and you fucking just kept them and now you're using them to go work out because you don't care, it's good to try to teach that person why getting a pair of waterproof fucking headphones with like an amplifier in them is going to enhance their life experience.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where there's people who don't care about enjoying life, and it's kind of on the people who do enjoy life to help teach those people how to enjoy life. Only so far though, because then
I think
sometimes they don't want to know how to enjoy life.
There's definitely a point where it goes too far, because it's one thing to own a record player and have a record collection and have a bunch of vinyl that's really, you know, highly curated collection, and that's great. And then, you know, it's still okay to have a really fancy stereo to play through. And I think it's still okay if somebody wants to fetishize their hardware and get really nitty gritty about their cabling, but that's not what I'm really getting at. There is a point where we take the record player out of the home, and then it's this battery powered thing with this tiny little speaker. And I think at that point it's simply about playing the record and not about the actual sound that it produces. And I'm still waiting for somebody to have like a wind-up tube amplifier.
It becomes about A, the capacity for it not to get stolen.
Yeah.
B, the capacity for it not to break if it falls out of your fucking pocket or your hand. C, the capacity for it to make a loud enough sound for it to be worth not then going back to the other one for the... So there's all these things where it's like... It would seem like it's one thing, but it's actually all these other things once people get out and realize, like, oh, you mean I can have a waterproof Bluetooth stereo that I can take out on a boat?
And it floats?
And so while we're floating while the boat's stationed,
and saltwater activates
I can do this
homing beacon?
instead of just using my phone, which might fall into the water and then fucking break.
Die in the water, yeah.
Yeah, so there's all these things about that process where at first it seems super obvious and simple.
Oh yeah, it's so easy. Just go ahead.
But then when you're at work listening to some music on your cell phone, trying to get in the mode, and you can't hear any bass because everything is coming through a fucking cell phone, then you're like, fuck, I wish I had a speaker right now. And then you realize they have Bluetooth speakers, but then the version you buy is the $30 one instead of the $90 one. And then you accidentally spill fucking soda on it during your work break, and now your $30 is shot. And you should have just got the $90 one in the first place because it could have fucking been waterproof.
2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago, I got this message, this weird spam from Walmart, because they were expanding their online services. And it said, sign up for a Walmart card today and get $25 off your next purchase. So I thought, yeah, sure, why not? Walmart's going to give me money. I bet they have something for $25 that I can buy. And so I'm perusing their offerings, and I come across this powered home PA speaker, 15-inch speaker, 1,500 watt peak output, Bluetooth. And it was $60. And so I applied my $25 off and got it for like $35. This thing's huge, by the way. It's the size of a dorm refrigerator. But it also sounds really good. Have to plug it into a wall. I'm pretty sure it would sync.
Is that thing?
No, it's in the back because it's kind of too big to just have out. But it has wheels. I have a stand for it so we can take it out on the deck. I got it so that I could like, bring music with me to work. when I was taking pictures at a music store, and so I just wheel this thing in, and we use it out back every so often. It's pretty good for when I need an additional amplifier for a keyboard or synthesizer. If I want to just have a louder than cell phone speaker outside, really. But it is possible to get giant speakers for less than $100 shipped to your door. You just gotta wait for that sweet deal from the internet, and sometimes the internet
delivers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it comes through.
Yeah.
It's like one of the few times that I was really pleased with an online purchase at Walmart. Every other time, it's like they don't give you accurate tracking information, or they give you an email like the day that it shows up. I don't know. I haven't purchased anything from Walmart in a long time.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So
I haven't purchased anything.
my memories of their online offerings are flimsy at best.
Yeah. Well,
I can't really be too. I'm not trying to complain because I got a sweet deal, but I'm not really pleased with the company that relies on forcing its employees to subsidize their earnings through government socialized services.
Yeah.
That's kind of.
Even I mean,
Walmart's
a weird one.
Just thinking about that makes me feel like that kind of. It's like book cookery.
What is it? Okay, so let's do a hypothetical experiment, a thought experiment. What is a capitalist company supposed to do in the face of a government that allows them to do capitalist things?
Make money.
Yeah.
That's it.
So how is anybody supposed to ethically hold Walmart accountable in light of a government that's not going to hold them accountable?
Let's stop shopping.
Exactly. That's the only thing we can do as individuals. Like, talking about Walmart and shitting on them does absolutely nothing compared to actually not shopping there.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing we can do about it. Because then if we talk shit about them, then have to go buy our fucking toilet paper and milk there.
Yeah.
That's this false sense of doing something that people get wrapped up in, I think, where it's like, we can talk about
the
all
weird
the
part. Like, I can't complain, but there are all these things that happen about it. It's just like, man, all all the stuff that you have to be complicit with to go shopping at Walmart. You have to be cool with this is how they treat their employees. This is how they do all these things. This is how they do business. But the weird part is Walmart in China is like the most amazing supermarket there is. They have fresh meat and fish, and it's like a completely different experience than it is here. Except it looks the same.
So have you seen The Good Place at all?
Oh yeah, I love that show.
So what you're talking about is discussed in The Good Place in a way, in the sense of when you just exist in modern times, those
strawberries you want involve this whole chain of events that require that you accept colonialism.
Not just the strawberries. Every decision
Tomatoes
you have to choose from has some negative impact that you have no capacity to influence except not to choose that. And then in the process, every choice has those negative associations. Yeah. So everything you do has negative consequences in this economy, or in this philosophical approach to exploiting humans. Because what it comes down to is you can't allow this type of thing to happen unless you're okay with the exploitation of humans in some context.
Anywhere. Or it's because it's a global supply chain economy.
Right. It's not that it's either you're okay with it or not aware of it, and this is why there's so much effort to misinform the American public about the impact of their actions on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that's like when I was in middle school, we had a presentation given to us about the impacts of how Nike was using child labor
in Malaysia, wasn't it?
And the teacher that was giving us the presentation, I only found out later, was she had to fight to give us the presentation because the administrators didn't want to let the kids see it, because apparently they didn't think it was worth shattering the kids' sense of the world to be exposed to these things. And they actually had an all-out internal struggle to get the permission from the parents to show these things to the kids in a way where, once I found out that she fought the administration to show this stuff, and how much it made an impact on me in the sense of like, it must have been, let's see, 7th grade, 90. It must have been like 95, 96. It wasn't known widely that Nike was using sweatshop labor with children yet. So this element of...
I think it was like the kind of thing that people joked about. But
I don't even think people joked about it because nobody even had the concept of it yet. I feel like in the mainstream, not in the mainstream.
I'm trying to remember the 90s, actually.
That's what I'm saying. It's hard, dude. It's hard to remember pre 9/11 anything.
Yeah.
But the thing, okay, I'll give you an example. When like people would say fag or faggot, like as if
it was nothing.
Like it was nothing. It's so hard to remember that because it's so different now that if you even remote, like this stream might get flagged for me even saying that in the reference of that historical period because things are so different now.
No, it's true.
That people
it really is.
People who weren't born then or didn't exist then have no concept of how even remotely different it was that close in history. So when people harken back to different periods and like isolate certain things and forget how everything else was, it gets super dangerous, especially like the closer you go back. A lot of people forget about like Matthew Shepard and like the atrocities that are like the atrocities that transgender people are experiencing now. Gay people were experiencing like 30 years ago, not that long ago. That was not that far in history where Jerry Springer, I'm realizing, is a huge factor in the way people see transgender in that he used to bring people on and have them out themselves as like part of a circus. And America was watching that shit with popcorn, eating it up, not realizing the damage they were doing to a huge population of people.
I think we knew some people that went on his show.
I'm sure. I knew a couple. I think
we knew like several people like from IU. Like
I know some. Our lunch lady in high school.
Whoa.
Some of her, I think her niece or her daughter went on, but it was like as a joke. So it was one of those things where once you knew somebody who went on and then found out some people went on and faked shit, then you see the theatrics and how what was being presented as real had clearly fake shit. Because people would be like, oh, yeah, I'll go act a fool for a free trip to Chicago. Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
So it was like...
They just had to come up with a good story.
Yeah, so...
Get a good story,
that,
you can get to have
shit,
your 15 minutes of Jerry Springer fame, which is, like, I feel like that's worse than the freak show.
Right. So it's hard to know what... Because the producers don't care. If you're willing to play it out,
bottom line mentality.
Yeah, and that's kind of where there came a point where Jerry would start calling people out when he's like, are you guys like some of the things would be shown where they would call people out for making this shit up. Yeah. But for the most part, they didn't care about if people were lying.
I don't think that show relied on credibility so much as it relied on the whole instantaneous outrage or the visceral reaction of somebody learning something that's been hidden from them that they should have, if they weren't oblivious, they would have picked up on it. They would have known that their mother was gay or their father was gay or that their grandfather was in a relationship with their best friend. If they weren't oblivious, they would have noticed that if that person was actually their best friend.
Oh, you mean like the people that didn't know George Michael and like fucking
the other guy from Wham
what's it, Freddie Mercury were gay.
I think they
didn't know people. These people didn't know Freddie Mercury was gay. They thought he really liked fat bottom girls. That's a whole generation of people.
There was also a generation of women who thought Liberace was into women.
Right. Those are the same people that don't want to call transgender people by their proper gender. It's the same people. It's the same fucking people.
Do you think it's willful? Or do you think that some of them are like...
I'm still trying to figure out half of America. That's why I lean on the bell curve.
It's like I was saying last weekend. I have a friend who told me that her spouse is like, he just doesn't remember faces. You know, so maybe that kind of condition is more complex, and there are varying degrees of I don't want to say severity, of depth to this condition, where you can kind of recognize certain facial features, you can kind of recognize some features, but not all of them. And
I mean, that's just one aspect of it. I'm talking. Okay, apply the bell curve
To that.
No. That's one thing. Apply the bell curve to morals
oh well,
and ethics.
that doesn't make any. Then ethics and morals are flawed, but if we think of it like that.
No. I'm not even talking about ethics and morals. I'm talking about the idea that people are even capable of processing ethics and morals.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh. There's a bell curve of the people's capacity to process the concept of ethics and morals. Not even discussing the ethics and morals.
But to objectively recognize like an
Yes.
ethical or moral dilemma.
Yes.
And then to provide some kind of response that is
70% of people can't recognize when they're having an ethical or moral dilemma. And they just act as if nothing is happening. And below, as it gets worse, when you get to that 50% and below.
that's like an animal reaction at that point.
Exactly. And those are the people where you're like, okay, I'll give you a great example.
Should we really be giving those people guns?
No.
I'm sorry.
No. Here, I'll give you a perfect example. I know you have, but I'll frame it as a question. Have you ever been in public with someone you know, have known for a long time, encounter a third party who then starts saying things that are crazy? You and the party you know start making nonverbal communication with each other to start questioning what's going on. Of course you've had that happen.
Oh, yeah.
So what's happening there is there's this element of that person is so aloof. That person has such lack of awareness that their morals and ethics allow them to act this way around people they don't know. And then they have no capacity to gauge how you two are reacting and communicating around them. And they just keep acting that way anyway. So there's all these things about, now they're starting to get into more complex or types of intelligence. But there's intelligence for anything that we can do or think of or encounter. There's an intelligence to it, and there's also the bell curve to it. And that applies to morals and ethics and the ability to even consider morals and ethics.
Yeah. What about people who are not necessarily they're more intuitive, and so things will happen naturally for them, but it's not because they are intellectually gifted,
Right.
or because they have some advanced intelligence that, I mean, maybe intuition isn't, in being intuitive is its own kind of intelligence.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like that's
It
like
is.
the nexus
That's
of
what-
intelligences, where they come together to give you intuition and allow you to do things intuitively.
Baseball is a tangible example of that intuition tracked in the form of the process of a batter hitting a ball should be physically impossible in that the time it takes for a human to react to something. This is a good place to start talking about latency. Humans are not connected to real time because our brain has to process things. So there's different periods of processing for different things. So for example, visual processing may be is basically the fastest because photons move the fastest. So our capacity to sense things is going to be the quickest in the area in which things move the fastest. So in that, what ends up happening is our periphery of our vision is where we sense things the most, not the direct line of sight. And this is because we want to
There's
see.
actually more periphery information in the periphery than in your direct line of sight.
And
If
that's
we
the
wanna be
most.
really honest
That's
about,
the
like,
most dangerous
how we
area.
have how we've collected the photosensors in our eyes. How
Well,
they developed over
it's. I mean, I guess it's nature versus nurture in the debate of why or when it happened, but the argument is that it's because the things that are most dangerous to you in the world are in your periphery because you can you can see the things you're focused on. So you need to see the unknown threats first. So that's where your vision needs to be the most finite for quick move, or the most sensitive to quick movement in the areas where you're most vulnerable, whereas it needs to be set for more refined detail on the thing that you're actively looking at and focused on, in the sense of you can't do both in the same place
Yeah.
with our eye because of the way our muscles are set. So there's all these things about human vision and the way we process. So this also gets back
Well,
to
with
sorry,
like,
go ahead.
with like I think that's where the concept of, well, I think the concept of the 1,000-yard stare comes from a battlefield. But if you gaze at a long distance for a long enough period of time, eventually you get kind of used to looking into the distance, and then a lot of the information in front of you starts to fill in.
Yeah.
You have to move a little slower. But there's a way to do this, like when you're walking out in nature. When I'm out in the woods, I try to look as far away as possible and focus as far away as possible sometimes, because then you can see everything in front of you. And it's really hard to do that because you're trying not to like step on a log or trip over a rock and bust your knee open, or any of those things that you don't want to happen. But there is a way to. I think we lose this ability when we're confined or when we're stuck in like cities where there are just buildings everywhere for miles.
Yeah. Well,
you even it's just like, no matter where I go, I have to go out of my way to find a space that doesn't have man-made objects in it. And I'm not including the vehicle that I'm traveling in. I'm just trying to like get someplace, and eventually you got to get out of the car and walk a little bit. But it's hard now. It's really difficult to find these places unless you go out west, where nobody wants to go out there because it's hot and dry and it costs way too much to develop.
Well, it only costs too much to develop because they develop against the land, and this is one of the elements of Western culture that moves to disconnect itself from nature, in that people cut their hair every 2 weeks and things like that. So there's all these things about quote-unquote natural living and living with the land that Western culture teaches everyone to go against, down to cutting your yard and not letting it grow, in the sense of that's what is seen as the pinnacle of an example of a good neighbor or a good citizen here, rather than being somebody who lets their yard grow with nature and where the nature wants to grow. So there's all these things about disconnecting the human body and the human mind from nature, that also gets back to when you were talking about the 1,000-yard stare. So it does come from the military, but what's super interesting about the origins of that concept or that term is they did a study on people who were in war, and they took pictures of them before they shipped off, during combat, and after they came back. And the 1,000-yard stare was something that happened after they came back, where obviously they had PTSD, but what happened was their visual, like the appearance of their physical form changed so drastically that when I look at you and you look at me, our eyes like reflect the light that's around us. Their eyes like stop reflecting light. And it was one of these things where it's like the light in their eyes literally go out.
Oh, weird.
So it's like when they talk about the 1,000-yard stare, there's like fucking scientific documentation of the light in people's eyes being dimmed by their fucking experience being jaded.
So there's like a physiological correlation somehow
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
trauma and then the neurochemical changes that would occur along with that. And over time, that is reflected
Changes in the musculature
of the physical structures of the iris
Yes.
that reflect light back.
Yes.
So
they
so hormonal changes to the brain, chemical changes to the brain have influenced
which is why not everybody gets it.
And
but
and a tour of duty is only what, like,
well, it depends. The
years
issue
back
is
then.
that
So they
some people would get multiple tours,
Oh,
and this
wow.
is what would happen. It's like either through an especially traumatic tour or somebody who had gone on multiple tours. It's like everybody who serves doesn't get the 1,000-yard stare, and everybody who gets PTSD doesn't get it. It's a very specific condition, and that's when you brought it up, I was like, oh, this is a good example to like
interesting.
show.
I wonder if there's something to do with the kind of weapons they used during that conflict and like the kind of technology behind the weaponry and the chemicals, and then the terrain and the way they would all be used. I'm sure that there has to be some kind of correlation with all of that.
I mean, it didn't
still
only
happen?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Oh,
it didn't
still
only happen
happens
to them.
Okay,
yeah,
so
and that's why
this is a battlefield,
not just battle, but that's why
related thing.
It was originally discovered in doing this study about the effects of war on physicality. Wow. And that's where the term originally came from. But then once they had a term for it, it doesn't only happen from war at all. It's like basically from PTSD, that there's so many different things that the body, like, everybody doesn't react the same to trauma. So, like, for example,
it's interesting because, like, when I think about that, I think of it's like when I had my first software job, and I found myself sitting and staring at a computer for even longer, for like 8 additional hours of the day. I would just be at a computer the whole time for the most part, and there were times where I could feel like my eyes were getting stuck, and I would look away and I couldn't focus on anything that was further away from the screen. And that sucked, actually. I went and saw an optometrist about that. But my solution was, because there were big windows in the building that the place was located, I would just look at the farthest object and try to focus on it. And so there was a building across the parking lot that was made out of brick. And so I would look at it until I could resolve bricks. Mm-hmm. And then I would look across the way where they were building an apartment complex, until I could start seeing details. I didn't have to see a lot of details. I wasn't like trying to read license plates or anything absurd, but, you know, just trying to resolve what's in front of me so that my eyes would unlock, in a sense. And then one day it occurred to me this place had skylights, and there was almost always a vapor trail, like some kind of condensation trail above the building that I could just like stare at until I could start seeing lines form, complete lines, not just like a white stripe in the sky. That was probably that's actually one of the best memories I had working for that company, was those brief moments where I would stop what I was doing and try and look as far away as I could and focus on whatever I could find that wasn't inside the building.
Yeah.
And that's a really strange place, actually, now that I think about it, because in a sense I'm trying to get out of my head so that I could get back into my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very...
It's like a moment where I would just breathe and let go of the room and just not really even look at anything.
Well, that moment is the element of attaining the flow in the now that a lot of Zen swordsmen would try to express as the point of trying to meditate on the concept of unlocking one's capacity to build upon all of the knowledge that one has learned up until the now, to interact with the moment in order to express it. Because the paradox of existence is that the brain cannot be occupied with the now and what is happening in the now, while also trying to express something, whether it's about the past, present, or the future. These are the inability to have dual train of thought in the way that computers have quad-core processors and can quote-unquote think about 4 things or 8 things or 16 different things at once, but it's because they don't have a single entity of a conscience that is, well, they have a CPU. So it's a central processing unit in that there is a central processor, but it's only built that way because it was modeled after the brain, and it doesn't necessarily function the same way as a brain. Yet I digress. The problem with the brain is that it can't do 2 things at once with what we know as ourselves participating. So,
oh yeah, there are all those like peripheral actions that occur as a result of experience modulating the control interface to our muscle skeletal Gundam suits.
And that's a great way to put it, because in effect, we like to think of ourselves as a body when really it's just a suit. All of it's just a suit to protect that little
Our
ball
nervous
of meat.
system.
No, not even the
It's
nervous
a ball
system.
of fat.
It's all to protect the brain.
Yeah, that thing's mostly fat.
All that stuff is to protect the brain. That human heart can be replaced.
Yep.
That brain, once that brain starts to be even remotely modified, you start to lose parts of yourself in a way that's not the same as losing physical parts. And this is the thing where what we don't understand about the brain quite yet is a fucking ocean. And this is kind of where I'm not going to ascribe a soul or anything philosophically abstract or anything like that to this discussion. Strictly in the sense of, for all we know, right now, all of our personality is contained within our brain. None of our personality exists outside of our brain as far as we know right now. It could, but the only thing that...
And we're talking about like the brain, not like the cerebellum or the cerebrum.
The whole thing. Yeah.
The entire thing.
The entire thing, because certain parts can be lost without complete loss of personality.
Well, they can take a hemisphere out of somebody and they'll like be
a lot.
They might be functional.
Yeah, they could be the exact same person.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is there's no formula, because everybody's brain is functionally as different as the thumbprint.
Yeah.
And that's where it's hard to say that while then justifying things like fMRIs to then say, well, if everybody's brain is different, why would you even do brain scans? Well, we can have baseline areas that have similar
well, I think
activity.
The idea to do an MRI to a brain is to look for like structural deformations or for contusions or any kind of like physical damage. That's the reason they're looking.
Okay, you say that, but then in that context, what's a deformation if everybody's brain's different? I mean,
like a structural thing, like a blastoma that could rupture and cause an aneurysm.
Right. Of course,
that's
of course.
What I mean.
Of course.
I don't mean
but
like.
What I'm just rebutting it from the person who's asking.
Sure.
Like, well, what is a deformation then if everybody's brains?
I think it's literally like a blood vessel that has a thinning wall that could rupture and cause an aneurysm, or it is a portion of the brain where the vascular tissue has, for whatever reason, become inflamed and is not passing enough blood, or a section where like the let's see, maybe there is some kind of issue with the sheathing that allows the optical nerve to pass from the back of the brain all the way back to the front, and it's causing some kind of it's preventing adequate blood flow to the nerve tissue. Things like that. I think that's what they're using, that kind of technology. That's what it should be used for.
Oh, of course.
But I also know that they use that technology anytime somebody gets into like a car accident because they want to make sure they don't have they're not bleeding.
Yeah, of course. But what I'm saying is there is effectively a paradox of things that are unique in reality but have an average that can be measured and described by science in a way that gives a false sense of understanding that was perpetuated as a solid and legitimate sense of understanding to create an authoritative culture, which now is starting to fall apart because those people didn't understand what they were doing. And this applied in psychology, it applied in understanding of the weather systems.
When I first went to IU, I took this neural basis of human behavior class, and I remember they brought in brains, and they're like, well, this is a healthy brain, this is an old brain, this is a young brain, this was a criminal's brain, and they all look the same to a lesser extent. Like the old brain had a few more wrinkles than the others. The young brain didn't have as many wrinkles. It wasn't as developed. But for the most part, they all looked like, if you can imagine cauliflower that has been made out of clay that has been smoothed over, that's like pretty much what it looked like.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell from the surface.
No, I know. It was also basically the same. It was like looking at two steaks. It was like, I know that these are steaks, and I recognize that they're different. And they had like structural similarities, but the nitty gritty was they're not the same thing.
Yeah. And here's
but I think that you can.
Here's the issue is like when they look at criminals' brains and they see a common activation of common areas of activation across certain types of criminals, those things are valid findings, but they don't necessarily mean anything, and they don't necessarily not mean anything. And this is why it gets complex, because it's hard to in real science.
I don't think this. I mean, we know that there's like a association with the with the folds of the brain tissue, and then like memory capacity or something like that, right? Or
not necessarily. I mean, that's what they used to think.
That's what they used to think. Okay,
yeah.
So that's something that was
and it's because of looking at people's brains like Albert Einstein.
So there's no real correlation between the physical structure of a brain and the capacity of the computer itself.
No.
And so in that case, it's just
some people's have variations that may then cause differences.
Identifying a brain as a criminal's brain induces bias.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem. So, the issue is the framing of establishing a group of.
Is the framing designed to lead a dialogue?
Yes, and intentionally and both unintentionally in that,
because it might actually be the brain of a criminal, right?
It is, but the issue is that when they find these things, they're misrepresenting that they can then extrapolate something about the real world from these findings, because you can't.
Yeah.
The only thing you can do about...
You can't like plug it in and reactivate it and get it to be like, yeah, let's go do this shit.
And well, as far as when you look at scientific studies serve a purpose that is different than what they've been made to appear to serve, in that they are meant to find trends and prove that those trends exist, not to say why those trends exist. It's meant to infer in what the scientist believes may be the cause, but science does not define what those trends actually mean to the real world. And this is the difference between an actual scientist versus a pseudoscientist, where a pseudoscientist will try to attribute cause to something retroactively or proactively in the real world, whereas you can only attribute causation in a laboratory setting, and you can only find correlation in the real world setting. So in fact, you can never find causation in the real world. You just can't do it, because there's always going to be a variable that you can't find and measure, because it's the real world and you don't know what it is.
Yeah.
There's always the unknown variable, and thus this is why real scientists never actually find causation in the real world. No real scientist will ever tell you two things are caused. One is a direct cause of the other in the real world. They will tell you that about a lab, not the real world. That said, when you have people who are trying to then disenfranchise academia, what they do is they become the people who frame what science is trying to do, and then they'll start to say, well, if this is a law and this is a theory, then which one is which? Because they don't understand that those two things actually have the same meaning in
I think
science.
there's a difference between the scientific pursuit of, or the academic pursuit of science, and its intent and its purpose. Those things are very different from when corporate interest employs scientists and asks them to use a scientific process, or a process based upon a scientific process, so that it can justify behavior, whatever it is. Because I've read far too many times about how some construction project or development project or some project goes on too long, and the environmental impact is well in excess of what should have been had the geological impact survey been factored into their development plan. You know, there's always something that doesn't happen, or humans are involved, and they may not fully understand why they're supposed to do something, and it might not get done right.
Well, and this gets back to...
And then it's not really in the corporation's interest to, their bottom line mentality in this whole thing still, no matter how much these entities want to talk about how, sustainability or think green or any of these fancy marketing terms, these broader brandings of, we align ourselves with some kind of political identity because we use the term sustainable. It's complicated, I think, because the forest, the nature has been doing its own thing for hundreds of millions of years, and then people got to come in and bulldoze the shit, and then they get mad when their water supply gets fucked up.
Yeah.
And then they got to add more chemicals to the water supply, and then
corrects it.
Yeah, but in the process, those chemicals were never intended to be used on the type of seals that have been applied to the water delivery systems, and so they cause those things to leach out other chemicals. And then you get kids who've got all sorts of really nasty kidney or liver issues.
And it just happens to be a predominantly black community.
Yeah.
Weird how that shit works out.
Or it happens to be the entire state of Michigan, but
right. I mean, yeah. No.
But yeah, that in itself is a predominantly black community.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of where there are elements of disconnecting the process of natural living that have happened over the course of 150 plus years that have been systematic in a way that now we're so disconnected from nature that, as you were saying earlier, you have to drive maybe 15 minutes to get to a place where you can then walk and turn 360 degrees and not see something that was built by man.
Yeah.
It's hard to do in modern times.
Sometimes you got to drive even further. Sometimes you get to drive an hour.
Right.
And
where it's not an earshot, where you
half
hear...
of that's driving on some gravel road.
Right.
Until you get to a place where you can't drive any further. Then you have to get out and walk.
And that's kind of, having that much dominion, quote unquote, over the earth, when it's not like that. Well, I'll say, whenever I am in a plane and I see how much of the plane actually hasn't been touched by humans, it gives me hope, because when you're in a city it feels as if everything is gray, but really nature is everywhere that we're not for the most part because we can't control it. So we have to have people locally fucking cutting it down in order to keep it in check, quote unquote. So that's kind of where you can kind of have some solace in the sense of like nature, however hard we try to fight it, unless we're there, we can't really keep it in check and it fucking takes over. So that's like, there's so much green everywhere, man. That we can't fuck it up because we just don't have the capacity to destroy that shit. And we're at the point now where we're destroying our own capacity to exist quicker than we can destroy the rest of the planet, that we either have to shift our trajectory and make our shit sustainable, or we're just going to have our own extinction level event that we're going to bring on ourselves, and we're going to reset in a way that I'm all for it, man.
I don't think that we can destroy the planet, but I think I think we can definitely make our atmosphere less hospitable to agriculture.
Yeah. And it'll hurt us, and some other animals are be fucked, but the planet will survive and it'll persist. And that's kind of where I'm like,
the planet will recover in 10,000 years and be like, oh, I thought you guys were in it for the long haul. And what few humans will remain will be like, you motherfuckers.
Yeah. No, man, because I look at it from the sense of, I personally like and really enjoyed life and existence. But I have to step back and look at our species and be like, does this shit deserve existence, like, beyond me? And that's what I'm like, kind of no. And for various reasons, in that, let's just look at poor children as one example. Like, poor kids exist.
Poor kids exist in America.
Poor kids exist, period.
I know, but
society shouldn't allow poor kids to exist anywhere. End of story. If we can't all agree on that, it don't matter if they're fucking in Syria. It don't matter if they're in Yemen. They don't have to be little American kids in order for us not to want them to be poor. We should work as adults to be like, let's end child poverty. Yeah. Period. But we can't even fucking agree on that.
Well, I agree with you. But I think that it's one thing to no child should grow up poor. That's just wrong. But we can't call America the great shining city on the hill if people are living in poverty.
Yeah.
And if we've got homeless people, so not too long ago I read that there's a study that was released, and it was like they were looking at homeless people. And a significant portion of them are suffering from some kind of, traumatic brain injury. Mm-hmm. Go figure. And a lot of them, and a significant portion of that number are ex-military.
Yep.
Because, lo and behold, that concussion mine that exploded, that IED or that rocket that landed in the building next to them, fucked them up.
Well,
really bad.
So what also is kind of disconnected in our history is that Ronald Reagan specifically shut down a lot of psychiatric hospitals and also VFWs and VA, like anything that was helping mental health, whether it was for veterans or for,
because the health industry was going to pick up and fill in the gaps.
Yeah, and then so they shut down a lot of these things and gave them tickets to fucking California.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the homeless population in California and San Francisco is a direct result of this active movement in American history where they just basically turned their entire backs on mentally challenged people for whatever reason.
Well,
and
I feel like there's been a long kind of a economic war against California from a lot of private interests within this country.
That's true.
And I think it's because California has always represented this place where people go to create a better life for themselves. I think it's one of those places that, I used to think of it as like, it's one of those always better in heaven type situations where people will create this version of California that has a lot more liberty than people realize.
Yeah.
They kind of lead the charge in terms of so many things that it's like, yeah, they're gonna vote on medical marijuana at some point, maybe this year, and California's like, guys, we're all, like our medical legalization is almost old enough to buy its own booze. Like, come on, give it the program. And so, I think there are a lot of private interests that stand to lose if the broader culture of California itself is somehow stifled. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, they stand to lose if the California culture is allowed to propagate further. And they win everything if they can just prevent that culture of we can still do it. I think in a lot of ways California represents what it means to be American. Like,
I mean, yeah, but it's like it's the worst. It's the worst because it's a pseudo paragon of success, in that Silicon Valley is the heart of exploitation of brown people for various reasons.
They exploit everyone, though.
And
like people in the Tech Valley itself.
Yeah,
they a lot of them don't even live.
I mean, because they can't.
They have to drive.
They've all exploited the land value now, so that they can't even fucking live there anymore.
Like anywhere from 2 to 4 hours driving, like one way.
But then they call themselves liberal.
Yeah, that's really surreal, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is where again I'm getting to the there's so much right-wing influence on the way that everyone exists in America that people who are the quote-unquote most liberal in America are doing some shit where you're like, if you had this on a list and was like, oh, this is Donald Trump, you're like, oh yeah, okay, sure. But no, it's somebody who works at Google and they're a left-winger in their own head and they're going to vote for fucking Bernie and they're Bernie bro, but they do all this shit.
I'm pretty sure that's called a California Republican, which is like a New York Democrat. No, it's not actually. New York Democrats won't vote for Bernie. They're going to vote for Bloomberg.
I don't know anymore, man, because this is where you look at the Bernie bros, and not all of them, but a good segment of them are, libertarian exiles that
just want a party to hang out with.
Just want a party to hang out with, basically. And then when their chosen candidate gets shit on, they start getting super racist and misogynist, and it's like, these are supposed to be people on the left.
Are those really Bernie bros, or are those plants?
Yeah, fuck yeah, no. There's plants. I've seen the plants.
Yeah.
But those are really people ask this question as if those Bernie bros aren't a real thing. Because this is the problem with
I know that there are some.
No.
There
I mean,
hateful Bernie Bros, but
this question has been being posed as if the Bernie Bros that are doing that are plants.
But can an exiled libertarian actually, ideologically, be a Bernie supporter?
Yeah, if they are actually a hypocrite and have a bunch of student loan debt, yeah, that's real easy for it to happen in America.
But is that actually a Bernie supporter?
Yeah.
That's their profile?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the fucked up thing is like, there's this intersection of people who have such crazy radical ideas, but also crazy radical circumstances that then force them to then start supporting people like Bernie. Like, oh, he's going to wipe out our fucking student loan debt. Hell yeah. And I love guns.
Yeah. In Mexico is going to build a wall.
But he's fucking okay with that.
Yeah.
That's how you end up with that dude, because Bernie is like okay with the wall. And there's this weird, and there's no perfect candidate, obviously. But the problem is,
I actually kind of like Tom Steyer. He dropped out. He announced that his candidacy was over today, I think. But I actually kind of liked him because he was all about the environment. Mm-hmm.
But he was a billionaire, so how seriously could he be?
He wasn't as serious a billionaire as Michael Bloomberg.
I mean, what's the difference?
pages and pages of blocks on some scale chart of how much money.
I mean,
they
but
actually
once
have.
it gets to a certain point, they can't
doesn't
spend it
really-
anyway.
yeah.
It doesn't really matter. One's just more better with allocating his sacks.
One was, well, I think Bloomberg is clearly a manager of some sort.
Mhm.
He's a high-level manager. He can probably manage, like, you know.
He can manage capital better than Steyer, clearly.
Yeah.
That's all that says.
No, but that's the thing. Is like the reason I liked Steyer was he had that he was all environmental, and that was his thing. He was big on environmental.
Was he
issues.
really though?
That's all he talked about.
That's all they talk about. Well, what does he do?
Who knows what he does?
Can you become a billionaire being an environmentalist? Actually being an environmentalist? Because then when you find out what Al Gore actually does,
He flies around in that jet.
you kind of can't.
An environmentalist who rides around in a giant SUV.
You kind of can't call him an environmentalist then. When you see how he actually rolls around and it's not all in fucking carbon neutral shit.
Yeah.
His private jet's not carbon neutral.
He's not flying the Prius of jets.
Right. So then that's where I'm like, yeah, I can talk about a bunch of shit all
but
day.
that's the thing is that when I listen to these the candidates talk in the debates, I don't really like listening to any of them.
Yeah, I
But
don't.
the only time I heard anything that I liked was when Starr was talking about the environment or when Yang was talking about doing math. And that was about it. That was the only time that I felt like, it's like, wow, these guys are actually talking about something that I might actually listen to. And then, cut to commercial because those aren't going to produce sound bites.
I mean, let's call it what it is. All the debates is a pander fest. So
Yeah.
then what good is listening to a pander fest when I know everybody up there is pandering to me? Everybody up there, and then some of them are going to be pandering to somebody else and then actively throwing me under the bus as somebody that they're not pandering to. So then I'm like, oh, fuck that person for not pandering to me. That's all it is. Once we get to a certain point, because they can all say anything they want.
That's
based
the
on
thing. It's,
like Joe Biden has lied so much about his record at this point. It's all just pandering.
Mayo Pete has this really interesting habit of just talking over people. And let's see what else I read that his campaign believes that their ultimate purpose is to prevent Bernie from getting enough votes to get the nomination.
Sounds like a Republican plant to me.
Yeah, that's like as Republican as it gets, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you mean like somebody who's a fucking war veteran who's okay with the military-industrial complex, okay with price gouging on bread, and then when confronted about questions on the bread price gouging scandal, didn't really deny it?
So I'm not even sure if this is true, but I found it really amusing. If Mayo Pete's middle name is Paul, he's PP butt guy. Which is kind of fucked up.
Yeah.
That's the kind of shit the internet has been producing lately. It's not even really entertaining at this point.
No.
We used to have really funny, like, satire of our political candidates, and it seems like they're writing their own material, and so our satirists don't really have much to work with. 'Cause it's like, I don't need to do anything else to this. I mean,
They just need to report what's happening.
we just need to report.
Like,
it's
today on Twitter,
it's all
Senator XYZ.
we've got some Onion World shit happening.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
As soon as our senators and legislators started using Twitter, we descended into the place we shouldn't be. We shouldn't have fucking Twitter. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be interaction with officials on a social media platform. There should be an entire government platform dedicated for them to have their own accountable platforms on which they... Like, everybody who wants to run for an office should be able to go to this platform. And this is the type of shit that doesn't exist because we're then inundated with this fucking cultish philosophy that the market will give it to us.
Why would the government create something like that? It's not when
the market can make it.
Exactly right.
The market will do it.
The market will supply us with this. They'll make sure that it's equitable.
The mythical market is the most hilarious shit that when you like look at how libertarians view the market, it's like worse than a kid in Santa Claus or the fucking Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy or some shit. Because I'm like,
who's the market? Who are they? Who's they?
why are they?
Why are they?
What are they? Because it's like the free market as an abstract concept is the same shit as God in such a way that if we weren't living in a capitalist society, it would be declared either a cult or a mental disorder for people who believe in the abstract market God, because it's such a ridiculous concept to have the notion of things. This gets back to the there's
internet
no
loves cats,
look.
right?
There's no causation in real life. So the idea that your fucking stock went up because something good actually happened can't be true. It can't be fucking true. That's not the way the real world works. And if they only had enough scientific understanding of statistics to understand...
We know that a lot of stock market activity is based upon rumors and,
Right.
and people's thresholds for when they're willing to sell or desiring to just hold on just a little bit longer.
I mean, it doesn't even happen with... Oh, no, I was just moving my chair. It doesn't even happen with just stocks. It happens with, like, the medical masks right now with the coronavirus.
Oh, that's right. I read about some N95 masks, which are, like, the bare minimum because they make an N99 mask. I think there's chemical masks, too, which have provided an even deeper level of protection.
Did you see the Surgeon General's warning?
Oh, you got to shave your face to...
No, for people to stop buying masks.
Oh.
Because they
need them for medical professionals.
Yes, and they only stop people who have it from spreading them, and maybe they don't know for sure that's the only potential way. So if people are wearing a mask and they don't have coronavirus, they might have actually just gotten the coronavirus by touching something that was contaminated, because they don't know if it's fucking by haptic spread or not. Because it could be by air, it could be airborne, but it could be airborne and haptic.
COVID-19 is one of apparently like 5 different coronavirus strains that are present in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's the basis for the regular, well, not 19, but 19. The coronavirus is the regular cold.
Yeah, it's the common cold. I heard on the radio today a healthcare professional talking about how they don't know if something is a virus or the flu or a cold. Those are all viruses.
Yeah.
And the one I was waiting for was like people with pneumonia, and I was waiting for them to mention snake pneumonia again. But snake pneumonia hasn't been mentioned in the media at all since they decided that it was back to bats.
Huh.
So I don't even think it's bat related anymore.
Well, pneumonia is a weird one because it's your body's reaction to something.
Yeah.
That your lungs are then flooded with fluid. So pneumonia is a weird one because then some can be spread.
Well, pneumonia itself can be a result of a lot of things. Your lungs just don't function properly, and they're not evacuating themselves.
Yeah.
And you're sleeping in an environment where moisture condenses, fluid condenses in your lungs more readily than others. Or it's viral, and you have there's just something wrong that's causing inflammation, that's causing fluid to build up. Or it could be chemical pneumonia because someone was smoking too much of that bad vape juice, and lo and behold, they were essentially developing layers of saran wrap in their lungs. Or it could be, I think there's hypoxia, not hypoxia. There's a condition that occurs when you're out in the cold, like extreme cold, and I'm talking like -15, severe wind chill, that kind of stuff, where the air is super dry. Because your lungs are warm, moisture will start to condense in those, and your lungs will fill with fluid. And this happens fairly quickly. This is like a survival thing, actually. If you're out in weather like that and you're going to be exposed to the cold for more than like 10 minutes in that kind of cold condition, you're pretty much inviting some really horrible respiratory condition. Most people don't go out when it's that cold.
Yeah.
Things don't survive in that kind of weather. That's that's cold enough to be another planet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, effectively, all the moisture in your lungs could be turning to like slush.
Yeah.
And it's gonna it's gonna be hard to breathe one way.
I imagine those poor bastards who are like huffing the vape pen like in extreme northern states where it's
oh my god.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Go to sleep. You wake up with a cold spot on their chest, and they because that stuff has to pool somewhere.
Yeah.
Ugh.
I don't know, man. That's a weird period where it didn't have. It's pretty much over, but
Yeah.
when you have contaminated shit on the black market that's like causing that kind of stuff, it's like, there's the fucking mythical market yet again. Coming in and fucking people up.
The market responded by scaring the crap out of people. They scared the crap out of people. They got their special fruity flavors banned. Basically, they had like cigarette policy applied to them.
So what it says is the market can't be its own, or it's its own worst enemy.
Yeah.
If you really analyze how the market works, because again, it's the constant appeal to the worst that causes the need for regulation and intervention that ultimately is the byproduct of an unfettered market, and that's
and the drive to be the first to market with something. Yeah. It's back to that first culture. Got to be first, because it's a race. You know what's funny is that I'm not really even sure what that kind of mentality is actually given us anymore. I mean, I know that Turing and what was it, Enigma, like the Enigma machine or Rosetta, whatever it was, his translation machine.
Yeah.
You know, obviously the first person to do that, like to reverse engineer the code machine.
Yeah.
But that's not really what I'm talking about. It's more like, I have an idea. Let's get it to market really fast so we can make money. That doesn't need to be the way. It shouldn't have to be the way things are.
Yeah.
And I think that like the automotive industry has made a lot of efforts to to not necessarily, they don't have to be first to do things anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've learned that when they rush shit, people get hurt. But maybe not, because I still read about recalls. I think that's like the one area. That's actually the reason we're never going to have like flying cars and civilian flight. Or if we do, it won't be civilian managed flight.
Right.
It'll still require really, really complex licensing. Yeah. Because we can't even trust people who own their own vehicles to maintain an adequate level of maintenance.
Yeah.
For their vehicles.
Unless there's
completely managed
maintenance agreements that come with the shit.
Yeah, but then they have to be actively paying for that stuff.
Yeah, there's a whole level of compliance that'll be necessary for that shit.
Yeah,
and that's kind of weird. When you really look at it as an adult, then you're like, oh fuck, I don't want flying cars.
Fuck no, that's dangerous as it gets.
Yeah,
I mean,
you can't trust people with regular ass cars.
Yeah. Drunken pilots. Seriously,
you get people who were like, near a fucking building and forget the difference between a brake and a gas pedal and go through a wall. Now imagine that with a fucking flying vehicle. And that's where
I can just see people getting crushed by people landing their flying cars.
Yeah.
Because, I didn't see them. It's like, really? Their phone was emitting its locator in your cabin. The black box indicates that your alarms were all going off. You didn't notice that there was a person there. That's how it'll play out in court anytime it happens. We've got 20 cameras from around the neighborhood that watched you set your vehicle down as its alarms started to go off.
Yeah.
I couldn't see them. They all look the same to me. It's like, I think that's really the kind of thing that'll prevent us from really enjoying the potential future that has been laid out in front of us. Is that there's this basic level of awareness that just isn't part of the meeting. We're not required to meet this level of awareness to join the social contract.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's
But how do you? I mean, where do we draw? How do we decide what's enough? And that's a really
Well, I
complex
think
question.
we're going through that period of trying to decide it, which is why cancel culture is now a thing. In that the social psyche is trying to decide what's okay and what's not to justify accepting someone into the mainstream consciousness in whatever capacity. So then you get people always on both sides of an argument, and then you get people who are the meta commentary, like Daniel Tosh. And then there's all these levels of then the commentary about the meta commentary, and there's this element of chain reaction of.
See, I feel like commentary of meta commentary belongs in a forum where
That's where it happens a lot of time.
But I don't think that needs to be broadcast. I don't think that should even be part of the show.
It shouldn't, but it is now.
But if it's becoming that.
But people do it for clicks too. So this is where you get quote unquote beef, being people just spinning their own meta commentary about commentary.
People that should be encouraging that kind of dialogue are the people who are monetizing the pages of those forums with AdSense, because they want to have those 10,000 clicks or refreshes every hour, because this dialogue is really awesome and it's getting in depth about this thing that people are really into, and lo and behold, they've got some like industry insider who's bleeding out little bits and pieces so that they can continue to have 10,000 clicks per hour because they just made however much money they make with their AdSense revenues.
I mean, and those are the people that are curating the feeds so that the tension is the highest and the interaction is the highest, which is why the byproduct is the most divided and most tense population on the internet that doesn't actually exist in real life. So that's kind of where it gives you the sense of like right-wing and left-wing people being on the verge of civil war in real life, but that's not actually true. It's just on the internet for the most part. There's shit that happens in the real world, but it always did. And that's kind of like, it's not really any different.
There's a family of audio companies that make audio processing, and for a long time one of the companies that's part of this bigger group made hardware that was notorious for failing, and so they had to overcome a pretty terrible reputation. But I remember finding a forum where people were complaining about this stuff, and the owner of the company appears on the forum and he's like, hey guys, here are all of our failure rate numbers. Here's literally all of our information. I'll share it with all of you. And so of course people are dissecting it and they're trying to find all the stuff that's gonna prove.
He's just doing it they're just doing the work for him.
Yeah, they think they're gonna find these things that show how he's running a poor business. But it turns out that his failure rates were either right in line with industry expectations, like the curve that any other manufacturer has. But what seems higher is, and it is a larger total number, because they are producing more units, like 10 to 100 times more units for a given product for that niche than their competitors. And so, of course, they're going to have more units fail. They're making 10 to 100 times more units. That's just, there's a term for when that kind of thing happens. I can't think what it is. But anyways, this is like, I guess it's an economy of scale type thing. There's only so much that we can do, I think, before things get really big. And what seems like a problem really isn't a problem. It's just the perception of it, because there are a lot of people who are complaining about it, and they're vocal, and they're on the internet, because lo and behold, they all had the same problem. But no one knows what those serial numbers are, so we don't know how close they are in succession on the line. There might have been one moment where a machine was at the end of its, the rollers were at the end of the thing, and so they didn't print something right. And who knows? Variables. Not a laboratory, it's the real world.
Right.
So,
Well, but this is the
and I think that the internet amplifies complaints, because anytime somebody has a concern, that they'll search for my product problems or issues, and then those those 5 people who complained on every forum they're a part of, that gets amplified even further.
yeah.
And then
But I think this is a byproduct of the notion of having to pay for things, and then some part of the population having those things not work, even though they paid the same amount as the people who have their things work.
yeah,
And this is like, for some people, capitalism doesn't work, and then the capitalists for whom it works then try to shout those people down, aka pretty much any other argument that happens. And then it's like, there's this sense of black and white. If you don't love everything about capitalism, you must be a communist. When people who are just trying to express like, oh, I was wronged by capitalism in this one area, end up getting compartmentalized like as communists just as soon as they start expressing any problems.
No,
you have to.
I love capitalism. It allows me to that's how we can put on this show affordably without having to jump through hoops to break through
sort of
prohibitive expense barriers.
Maybe. In the real world, you can't say for sure. It could have been capitalism. It could have been the technological advancements that happened for reasons X, Y, and Z that had nothing to do with monetary motivation.
No, I'm not. I'm thinking more in terms of my ability to find the hardware on eBay at like savings. At price
But I'm
savings.
saying that,
I think that's the capitalism part.
But I'm saying that is a result of so many things that people are trained to then attribute to capitalism by capitalist systems, which technically in the real world, we have no idea why you're able to access cheap technology right now compared to 30 years ago. We don't know what's the actual specific, and that's getting back to what I'm saying about as to why a real scientist would be like, we don't know. It may be capital. It could very well be. I'm not saying it's not, but we can't say it is because in the real world,
there's no certainty.
There's no certainty about what it was. And that's why, getting back to what McLuhan predicted, the fact that he predicted it was more about the intersection of technological progression in tandem with information access rather than capitalism, and that he predicted it 30, 40 years ago is as to why that's more likely in this case, but that's not necessarily the actual reality. And this is where a real scientist would acknowledge that it's a very strong possibility.
Capitalism is the mythical market, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
It ends up becoming this thing that is there. It's like giving. You've seen the Higgs boson equation, right? The thing that takes up that giant chalkboards thing. So it's big, right? It's like if they replace all of that with like a big bracket and a special character and just call it capitalism.
Right, yeah. This abstract, gigantic thing.
Yeah.
Well, and in that, it's all of the good things that have happened while it existed and none of the bad things. All of the other bad things are probably the byproduct of government regulation.
Well, no, like slavery was
that's the government, actually.
That was the government.
I mean, technically, the government's the one that made it fucking legal, so I can argue for capitalism in that.
Yeah.
Hey, the market was just doing what the government said.
Yeah.
So that's how you end up with that fucking weird argument.
Wait, it took 112 years, right, for them to finally decide on the federal level that lynching is a crime. That was finally passed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised it is, honestly.
I think that's like an attempted reach around. Like, I mean, good. You finally did something you should have done a long time ago. That's like.
Oof. This is like when they pardon people who have been dead for 100 years. Like, good job on recognizing that you fucking punished an innocent person. But they've been dead for 100 years. Sorry.
So when that happens, does that open up the state to civil suit for
sometimes,
like ruining someone's,
unless they've enacted laws that prevent him from being sued? Because what you're saying is like that's actually in certain cases, like maybe somebody got excised from their land or had something taken from them, and then it's found out that they were wronged multiple generations later. It is it's the same shit with like reparations for the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But this is also why. So, for example, the slave owners got reparations after slavery.
Yeah.
So, this is kind of where when people discuss the notion of reparations as if it can't happen for descendants of slaves, I can point at multiple instances in not just American but global history where reparations have happened for not the same generation who suffered the consequence. So it's not an impossible task. But the issue is then... So this is a great time to discuss the Elizabeth Warren thing. When people have, like, identity, in the West, identity is defined by certain things like where you're born, your ethnicity, and your DNA makeup. In certain cultures, they don't recognize DNA as part of that. And this is like the many Native American nations don't use DNA as a metric. Many African tribes don't use DNA as a metric. And this is why black people can't just be like, oh, what's my DNA heritage? Oh, I'm from Nigeria. Cool. That doesn't mean shit. There's a whole system of, like, Africans never lost their tribal connection. So if you're like Igbo or, whatever, they, like, the Hutsu or Tutsi, there's like all these different tribes that never lost their lineage, and that's kind of where it's being presented in a way in the West as if DNA establishes lineage everywhere, and that's just not how it works in some contexts. So then when you have somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who then was claiming Cherokee heritage, and then tries to excuse it by saying, I was told we had Native American heritage in our family. Well, that still doesn't qualify what you're saying.
She may have had like an uncle who married into the family who was part Cherokee.
I mean,
that,
even
right?
then.
But that's like that's not the same.
Well, it doesn't qualify you for
that's what I mean. There could have been something like, it's like, oh yeah, your uncle so and so's got like some Cherokee in him or something like that, and it just turns out that uncle is not a blood relative, that they married the aunt or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there isn't even a way for that kind of heritage to bleed over.
Mm-hmm. And in that, when instead of simply acknowledging that she's wrong 100%, tries to keep justifying it, there's an active impact on actual Cherokee who then have their narrative about their heritage defined by this woman who's not Cherokee. And it's like, this isn't the only example that's happened in this country, but it's an example as to where you'll frequently get the people who are being impacted as the subject of this abstract narrative that this person who's not part of that is deciding. And this is an example, again, of like, I don't want to call her a content creator because she's also a legislator. But when she's
legislators might create some content.
They definitely do, and that's the problem.
It's just a different type of content.
We
can be really
2020.
We can be really liberal with how we define a content creator, because it could be as simple as somebody who does a single frame comic for the local paper, all the way up to somebody who writes complex, and I mean like really complex anthologies of information. It can be anything. It can be an artist who.
I mean, there's amateurs and professionals.
Yeah, it could be somebody who paints paintings on pinheads or creates sculptures out of match heads, all the way up to somebody who's doing giant formed poured statues, like lost wax.
Well,
casting.
I mean, I'm talking about content in terms of media.
No, I know. I'm just trying to be as broad as possible. It could be somebody who uses words. It could be somebody who creates video, creates audio, creates a physical object. It could be a lot of things. So content creation doesn't need to be limited to only musicians or artists. It can be a lot if you're creating something.
Right.
It could be somebody who takes a picture,
I mean,
a
at the
shitty
same
picture, and then goes and edits the living crap out of it in Photoshop and turns it into this, something that sells a flower. So.
But what I'm saying is, there's a certain point that a content creator is only a content creator once their thing is digitized and disseminated through the internet, and that's what I'm talking about in the sense of you can be a sculptor, but to be a content creator,
you got to take a picture of it and put it on the
exactly.
internet.
And until then, you're not actually a content creator, in the sense of if the internet is a quote unquote container, the content is going in this container, and it has to be accessible.
The internet's
to this
great.
container.
It's both the container and the conduit for delivery of that container.
Yeah. But it was one of the reasons it's modifying the capacity for things to transfer between parties, which is also why then digital art became a thing that made art less quote unquote valuable in the modern mind, because art was valued based on rarity, and then once you could duplicate art, then only the original is valuable. So then if anything was digitally created, then it made things really super complex about if this is valuable. And this is very much why graphic artists don't have their work valued, because it doesn't have the capacity for somebody to turn around and sell it, which is ultimately what that shit is all about. And there's all these things about that system that make it very complex as to why you can't turn around and then say art's valuable because of X, Y, and Z because of the real world effect, but then you can't turn around and ignore all of the things that are associated with the gradual increase in valuation of select artists and their artwork that also doesn't happen within graphic art, and the potential reasons as to why, and then extrapolate as to likely the reasons, instead of saying these are the definite reasons. But this is then why you get people like Banksy, who then turn the shit on its head and create a fucking fake artist and create something that plays on the speculation in order to give a real world example of what people always suspect. But until he did it, you can't point it until you don't have anything to point at and to say, oh, this is an example of somebody who faked an entire artist and tricked the whole collectors industry into thinking this artist was real. Until Mr. Brain Freeze was a thing, or whatever the fuck the dude's name was, it was all speculative. Now we can point at exit through the gift shop and say, go watch that documentary and see how much of a farce the fucking art collecting community is. That doesn't mean some piece of art isn't worth millions of dollars. That just means people who are saying it's worth millions of dollars, in a lot of cases, don't know what they're talking about. In a lot of cases, they're lying. And in some very few cases, they may actually be accurately describing the value of something. But when you have that Da Vinci piece that was sold for $500 million, that's basically fucking money laundering. But it's only because of certain things that allow that shit to go on in front of everybody. So, again, this is the real world effect where we're saying, a lot of people have a problem with modern art because of the resulting effect of appearing as if somehow overnight some random pieces of paint on a canvas are worth millions of dollars, and there's no rhyme or reason as to what is going to decide who's the next big $1 million artist. In Basquiat's fucking amazing, but the only reason his shit became valuable is because he got in a circle and then died effectively. Otherwise, if he hadn't started dating Madonna, probably would have never known who the dude was, even if the quality of his art was the same, because these romanticisms start in weird places because of the way the culture happens.
I mean, I think he was going to exist because Andy Warhol needed another person to suck the life out of.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother timeline where he was Andy Warhol's fucking ghost creator
Yeah.
until he was old, and nobody ever found out until he existed, until he died of old age.
Yeah.
That's a whole different timeline.
Yeah.
Because it happens to other people.
Yeah.
And that's that weird shit where you like, you know, we got that movie Hidden Figures about Catherine.
She died.
Yeah.
Today, or
It was like
yesterday,
last week, I think. But she died last week, but we didn't fucking find out about her until she was an old lady. Because capitalism is really good at hiding those kinds of people.
Oh, but we know, like, down to the minute that the founder of Trader Joe's has passed away.
Right. Or when Kobe passed away.
Oh, that's right. Kobe passed. Well, he got helicoptered into the ground. That's like,
But we found out about it before his family did, because capitalism wouldn't not let that story slip through because they could sell so many ads.
oh, that's something
That literally happened. That literally happened.
God, see, that's like an
everybody
extra layer to that messed up onion of.
Dude, everybody in America found out about that shit before his fucking family, because TMZ would not stop. They would not run the story. The cops tried to get them to not run the story, and TMZ refused to not fucking run the story. So that shit happened. And people don't even grasp the implications of finding out about somebody's death before their actual family. You're a random person. I mean, not you specifically, but a random person found out about that dude's death before his actual fucking wife. Because the police were not able to stop some fucking asshole news outlet from wanting to sell ads on the story.
This is the culture of gotta be first.
Yeah. That's the I mean, and the problem is, it's not meant to be like, oh, this is an unfixable situation. It's more so people aren't even like looking at it from this angle to be like, okay, how do we get out of this mindset as to where, like, it's okay for somebody to run a story about somebody's death and then sell an advertisement. Like, how are we going to get people to stop clicking on those stories? Is how we can only get people to stop clicking if we have the conversation.
How do people get obituaries in the paper or anywhere?
It's only a section.
It's only a small section, right?
Yeah.
Maybe obituaries and reports of people's death need to be limited to the obituaries.
I mean, they should be.
That seems like the kind of place. I feel like that's the kind of thing that would be recorded and stored at a library.
Obituaries should not be on front page.
Yeah,
like nothing. That's it. No eulogies.
Like I feel
should not be front page news. That should be like an actual rule, where we're looking at shit and it's like, yeah, we shouldn't be being the subject of a news story that is the focus of headline news should not be anyone's fucking, like, nobody's family should have to deal with that. It doesn't matter who the fuck they are.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Just period. That's something that I feel like is just.
Well, that's one of those human decency type scenarios where I think it's not even a Kobayashi Maru where you can't win. It's all you got to do is not be a dick, just be a human being and give people some dignity.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's not the kind of thing that gets clicks on the internet.
No.
It's not sensational.
Well, hard.
I was looking at a library consortium website last night, and it was so easy to find information. It was like surfing the nicest version of the internet. It was clean. It didn't smell funny. There was no rando there to get distract me or anything. All of the links actually went to the place they said they were supposed to go to. There was no dead links. There were no error loading anything, and the search engine was like just woo.
Now imagine that in a virtual environment.
Oh, I'm trying to, because it was like the best version of the internet I could possibly imagine. There were no commercials.
Well, I'm saying
there was no advertising.
Imagine if you can go to a virtual library that's like an actual library where you're looking at all this stuff in a graphic form in a way that gives you the experience of being in a library, but it's all by yourself. And this is kind of where, right? You know, there's ways that we could be using technology that we're not. Because when you said Kobayashi Maru, you reminded me of the virtual Star Trek experience. Like, the first thing they do is give you the Kobayashi Maru on that game.
And you're like, what? I don't even know how to play yet.
Right, yeah. But in that, it's like, I think when looking at, like, the way you interact with information, because it's all being curated for us in a way that we're subject to. Like, when you're talking about going into a website of the library and seeing, like, the information presented in a way that gives you the access directly to information without having to sift through the noise, there's no ads. And one thing I've noticed is that shopping at Aldi, because they don't advertise, like, my mind is in a completely different place when I'm shopping in the grocery store because I'm not being bombarded with shit that's trying to, like, distract me with a sales pitch. So then everybody's subject to that all the time. We're not ever free from, like, the advertising sales pitch anywhere. So then that becomes this issue of, like, when you describe that library, the freedom from distraction and the ability to shift one's focus wherever one desires without any outside influence, I think is, like, what I'm seeing as the appeal of virtual environments.
It was literally the best version of the internet that I've seen ever. It didn't have any of the annoying crap that I have to install extensions to block.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have any of that stuff. My script blocking extension had, like, no activity. It was so weird. It was like somebody on their end, someone on the who employed at the web development team for that library consortium understands how to code HTML5 like a master, because everything was smooth. It wasn't relying on really weird activity. There was no weird activity. It was just clean, and it looked good too. I mean, it looked like a library, but it was a website.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
it was so cool.
It's really hard to find clean.
It made me feel like Facebook is a mall.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a really shitty shopping
Dave
district.
Chappelle really did a good job of visualizing the internet in that skit, but I think while it was meant to be a funny metaphor,
Yeah.
I think it was kind of lost in the comedy, because then it really... People dismiss the internet as not real life because it doesn't... there's no necessary, like...
Well, we wouldn't have the in real life...
Right. Yeah,
saying
exactly. If there was no sense of internet being something that didn't happen in real life.
It's a cyber life.
But then that removes everything that you discover from this notion of having a real world impact. And there's a byproduct of that ultimately results in the virtualization of the real world that makes people disconnected from nature once again and the rest of the world in a way that I think regularly disconnecting from internet and social media reconnects people with that. But in that context, if you didn't have that connection in the first place, simply disconnecting from social media isn't going to get you that. Sometimes, like, some people have never gone on a hike in their life and have never heard the silence of what silence sounds like in the middle of the woods. Like, there is a noise to silence. There's sounds that are constantly happening, and then it's like, until you've actually experienced that, you don't understand what the hum of the earth sounds like.
Yeah. Or if you've never been in a sensory deprivation tank, you've never actually heard what your body sounds like.
Right. Yeah, that too. And shit like that, where people, if they've never heard their own heartbeat and gotten to a point where they've been able to isolate their heartbeat out of the noise, they can't have a fucking profound experience just by disconnecting from social media in the first place. And that's a lot of people. It don't have to be teenagers, don't have to be old boomers or whatever. There's just a lot of people who've never had the chance or time or motivation to introspect in a way that I think we can't, there's a bell curve for introspection.
The introspection bell curve. I bet, I have a feeling that it's like a declining line.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, because then you see shit like younger kids are tending to be more, quote unquote, socialist in their leanings. So I think that there is a sense of, in the youth, there is more.
I think if we draw it as like waveform, or as a like a cascading analysis, then we would see a shift in the way it in the trend itself. And if we observe it strictly through age ranges, then it's not, obviously it wouldn't be the same. Like, but I think that.
I don't think it correlates with life experience directly.
No, I think there's like
time.
Yeah, I think it's like a generational thing, really, that is correlated to just being socialization. Really, you have to be around more people to even realize that there's more than you in your head. Like, and when you go out, like there are a lot of social forces at play that direct our actions and our decisions, and we can't really just separate that anymore. And I don't think that it's possible for.
I don't know if.
I think the reason that young people have different views is because they get to have this dual experience in growing up, where they see the internet and they have that cyber world, the cyber life, but then they have their real life. And there's a generation that didn't actually have that until they were an adult.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of growing up today that involves a considerable amount of caution and awareness that we didn't have to be as cautious and aware, I don't think, as children.
No, not at all. Well,
40 years ago, things were very different.
For sure. Well, the awareness of what was going on.
We could play around outside up until dark, and then, mom might yell or your dad might yell, like, come home, it's time for dinner.
But it doesn't mean things were safer. It means people were less aware of the dangers. And this gets back to what you're saying about that, like, that lack of awareness being more impossible to remove now. I'm not sure if it's something that it gets removed or something you have to build. And this is where there's no way to know, except that in the sense we have to give both the possibility that maybe people have to build a framework of how they connect and relate to the rest of the world, so then we're not looking at them as if they are somehow devoid of morals because they're not looking at themselves relative to their impact. They just haven't had a chance to form that construct yet, for whatever reason. And it's something that has to be formed and is not intrinsic. And that's what I'm starting to lean towards, just not get fucking jaded.
Well, not everyone is intuitive.
Yeah.
It's not everyone meets that threshold of intelligences where they can become intuitive about the processes that are laid out in front of them, or the situation that they're confronted with, or insert any variable here. I think there's a lot to be said for developing an intuitive nature. And it just comes from, I think it comes from exposure to ideas. And it doesn't have to be on a given time frame. Like, we don't have to make kids wait to study ethics. We can develop new ways to expose children to moral or ethical scenarios that put them in a state of dilemma. Like, how do we resolve this?
You mean like video games based on their favorite Marvel movies?
Yeah, something like that. There are plenty of ways to do this.
Well, that's
What
that's
better, although I question like the decision to provide the Hulk smashing things as an answer to anything.
No, that's very true, but that's also why he's always been framed as an anti-hero, not a hero.
Yeah.
And that's, Hulk's kind of been an adult character in that the Incredible Hulk TV show that was like Bill Bixby or whatever, that wasn't for kids.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a drama. So I don't think adults were ever under the impression that Hulk as a character was necessarily for kids. But then that gets back to this notion that some people in America are on this bell curve that think anything has drawings on it for kids. And they're the ones that let their kids watch fucking South Park and Family Guy and fucking Team America.
Yeah, Team America. Oh.
Yeah, some people's parents let their kids watch that because they're on that part of the bell curve, the cartoon bell curve that doesn't understand all cartoons aren't for kids.
You know, I know that the Hulk is being marketed towards kids because I see kid-sized Hulk gloves.
Oh yeah,
and I can't fit my hand in.
Now for sure.
I can't fit my hand in them.
Yeah,
Definitely
now.
They're made for children, though.
Definitely now.
I mean, that's what I'm talking about now. When I see these little kids with their hand glove thing, or I go to a friend's house and their kid has a Hulk glove, and I can't fit my hand in that thing. It's definitely not an adult toy.
I mean, there's Hulk adult toys.
Oh yeah,
but those are completely different. Those are completely different podcasts.
We're still talking about things that are suitable to be brought out in public. I assure you. Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.